Good morning. My name is Joe Hayes, and I am a Senior Research Associate at the Public Policy Institute of California. And welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the findings from PPIC's report, California School Districts and the Emergency Connectivity Fund. This research and today's event are supported with funding from the Sobrato Family Foundation, and we'd like to thank them for their generous support. For today's program, I'll present some key findings from the report and then answer questions from you, our virtual audience. If you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity, and as such does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates standing for public office. And now, on to the presentation. This report, along with a policy brief summarizing the findings, are available at our website, ppic.org. I'd like to acknowledge at the outset the crucial contributions of my co-author, Niu Gao, and of Darius Starr, who provided valuable research support on this project. Now, in several recent publications, PPIC has examined the nature of the digital divide, that is, the unequal access to computers and the connectivity needed to operate in the modern world. People involved in this examination typically speak of three main barriers to gaining access to these resources. That is, the physical infrastructure to bring a signal to your home or your school or your business, the affordability of a subscription to high-speed internet service, and or a suitable device to connect to it, and digital literacy, that is the capability of users to safely and effectively take advantage of those resources. So this is an examination of one program, mainly aimed at addressing the second of these elements, affordability, to a lesser extent, infrastructure. The Emergency Connectivity Fund was a federal program implemented to help close the divide, and today we'll give an explanation and an assessment of how well it worked, with a focus on equity considerations. What are those equity considerations? Well, the problem to be solved is unequal access to internet connectivity and computers along the lines of race, ethnicity, income, and geography, to name just a few elements. Especially since the COVID-19 pandemic closed schools for in-person instruction, we've tried to document inequities in student access to online learning. Now, even though schools have reopened for in-person instruction, many elements of online instruction, for instance, Khan Academy, homework completion and submission, for instance, Canvas, and parent communication like Aries, remain critical elements of students' experiences. And so we've documented the progress of efforts to narrow this divide, efforts at every level, local, state, and federal. The Emergency Connectivity Fund was a federal program, but it operated at more local levels. It provided money to individual schools, school districts, libraries, and library consortia to purchase goods and services that would help their students and patrons gain access to the internet. Applicants could request funding to purchase internet service or equipment to connect to the internet, like routers, modems, or hotspots, or they could purchase connected devices suitable for completing schoolwork, such as laptop computers and tablets. In certain cases where no other option existed, applicants could also request funds to construct new networks to establish a high-speed internet connection. So in this report, we examined school districts that applied for ECF funding, with an emphasis on districts that served high proportions of students that have historically been underserved in terms of connectivity, that is to say, English learners, Black and Latino students, and low-income students. And we wanted to know what kinds of districts applied to the ECF, how did they do in procuring money for their students, what did they do with that money, and then how well were they able to meet their students' needs. Now, a few words about the data that we're working with. These are application data from the Emergency Connectivity Fund, and they contain more than 3,000 unique applications from California itself. Of those, about 2,200 were school district applicants, about 2/3 of the total applicants for the state. applications, I should say. We identified of those 576 unique school district applicants. So it clearly was possible to apply for more, to submit more than one application to apply for different bundles of goods or services. And those districts were successful in securing $895 million in funding. That's the 92% of the total money secured by all California applicants of any kind. We then matched those applicants to the best of our ability with California Department of Education data, which allowed us to observe the student body makeup of each district and to focus on our target populations, as I mentioned, English language learners, Black and Latino students, and low-income students. The match was not quite perfect. We got about 81% of the districts matched to CDE data, but we managed to fully identify 465 school districts for the analysis that I'll go through just now. A brief word about our definitions. In the analysis that follows, we distinguish a district as having a high concentration of each of these student populations if their shares are in the top quartile statewide. That means for English language learners, high EL districts are those with more than 25% English learners. High Black and Latino student districts are those with serving more than 75% of students who are Black and Latino. And then low income districts are those where at least 75% of students are eligible for free or reduced price meals. How did they do? Applicant districts were fairly representative in terms of California's student population. They had similar percentages of students from the backgrounds we're looking at, 20% English language learners, as you can see here, versus 19% statewide. Similarly, fairly even populations of Black and Latino students and low-income students. The main exception was that urban district students were overrepresented among applicants. As you can see, 50% of students in applicant districts were in urban areas compared with 32% statewide. Another way of looking at representation is breaking down the state's districts into quartiles according to the populations we're interested in. So considering it this way, among ECF applicants, historically underserved districts were slightly overrepresented. Just to take the example of English language learners, they constituted a majority of ECF applicants. That is to say, of the 465 applicant districts, 278, that is on the right-hand side, you can see 148 plus 130. That's about 60% of the total applicants were districts that served above median proportions, above average proportions of EL students. For Black and Latino students and low-income students, those proportions are also 60%, 57% respectively. So it's not a huge difference, but the proportionality is encouraging. That is, essentially, the ECF was having some success in reaching the students that it was meant to reach. Looking now at how successful districts were at securing ECF funds, there are encouraging results here. Historically underserved districts secured a majority of the ECF money awarded in California. Of the total $859 million that I mentioned earlier that was awarded to all California districts, high EL districts were approved for $210 million, about 24% of that total. High Black and Latino districts secured over 60%, the $511 million figure you see on your screen. And districts serving low-income students got about 52% of the $447 million that you see there. So obviously, you can tell these categories are overlapping. High EL districts are often the same as low-income districts and so forth. But these results are encouraging as well. Another way to examine this, though, is to look at per student funding. High EL districts secured $229 per student from the ECF compared with $208 per student for non-high EL districts. Those are districts that don't serve high proportions of English learners. Those differences were even more stark for districts serving high shares of Black and Latino students, that $320 per student compared with $143. And then in low-income districts, the differences are even more evident, $355 per student compared with $148. As I mentioned, there were some choices about what you could apply for. And districts favored connectivity-related purchases across the board. But this is particularly true of the high-need districts that we're focusing on here. About 75% of them requested money for connectivity services, or connectivity services are, for instance, broadband subscriptions in the orange here, or connectivity-related equipment, for instance, modems and routers, or hotspots in the dark navy and the gold. That stood in some contrast to the non-high need districts that focused on connectivity subscriptions and equipment at about 67% of their applications. Districts without high shares of those populations requested money for purchase of laptops and tablets. Laptops at about 27%, tablets 6%. Compared with about 21% and 3% of the high need districts, respectively. So not huge differences, but worth noting. In the ECF application, district staff were asked to estimate the number of students in need of connectivity or devices, the number who would be served by ECF funding, and then the number in the last row, you see the number who would likely still be unserved afterwards. Now, these are self-reported estimates, and it's sort of before the fact, so there's no way to really evaluate how reliable these numbers are. These are estimates by the district staff themselves. But some differences emerge. High-need districts in each category responded that they expected to meet about 74% of their estimated need for connectivity using ECF dollars. Non-high need districts estimated about 70%. As for who would remain without full digital access after all was said and done, high EL districts estimated that about 9% of their students would still lack access after all of these efforts. That's the 2,000 out of the 22.6 thousand you see. That percentage was 15% and 16% for high Black and Latino districts and low income districts, respectively. Again, the 3,000 and out of the 20,000 for high Black and Latino. Districts that weren't categorized by high levels of these populations estimated that about 10% of their students would still lack full digital access even after the ECF funding. So how can we assess the performance of the Emergency Connectivity Fund? For one thing, California school districts serving high percentages of the populations we're looking at responded well to this funding opportunity. They were well represented in the applicant pool. They were able to secure high levels of per student funding, higher than their counterparts in the state. And they focused on services and equipment dedicated to expanding internet access more than on purchasing devices. But according to the applicants themselves, between 9 and 16% of our targeted populations would still lack full digital access after the implementation of these funds in their districts. What are the full effects of the program? That's too early to tell. Although the last application window closed in May of 2022, recipients had until last month, actually June of this year, to complete their purchases of goods and services specified in their applications. So if there is a connection between ECF applications and closing the digital divide, it could be at least another year before we could accurately measure that. What resources remain? What's left for districts to do? As mentioned, the ECF has wound down and the final eligible dollars were spent last month. There are several other federal and state programs that continue to provide funding for these purposes. On the federal side, the programs listed here together are slated to provide more than $60 billion over the next several years. Obviously, the eligibility and the eligible purchases are going to vary between the various focuses of these programs. At the state level, California's the Senate Bill 156 emphasizes connecting historically high needs communities throughout the state, providing funding for improving all three elements of digital access that I mentioned earlier. That is to say, infrastructure, affordability, and digital literacy. And finally, there are many local efforts continuing throughout the state in the form of nonprofit organizations as well as community-minded ISPs that work to get people connected. So thank you so much for tuning into this presentation. I'd like to encourage you to submit any questions to PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com, and please include your name and organization. We have several minutes left here to answer those questions, and I'll start with some that are coming in already. We have a question from Karen Mix at CS4 NorCal grant. I saw that only 3% of rural districts receive funding. Can you speak to that? Did they not apply, or did populations overlap with rurality? I'm glad you asked that. I should have mentioned this at the outset. Those are not exhaustive categorizations. I just put up urban and rural, and there are two other designations specified in the application data, and one of them is town, and the other is suburb. So I wanted to highlight the disproportionality in the proportions of urban applicants. As you saw, the rural applicants were pretty similar between, the numbers were pretty similar between rural applicants and the rural population in the state as a whole. So I don't think that there's much disproportionality there, but I think the difference is made up in the two designations that I didn't put up, which were small town and suburban. So to answer your question, they did apply, and they applied in about the proportion that they exist in the overall population. But that omission, I admit, is a bit misleading. We have a question from Sacramento about why did we focus just on school reports? The report focused just on school districts, excuse me. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. There's a number of reasons for that. School districts submitted the majority of California applications to the ECF. I think I mentioned this earlier, 66% of applications, about 2,200 out of the 3,300, and secured the vast majority of the funds. So 92% of all the dollars that were awarded to California entities went to the school district applicants. More to the point, our focus was on students. So the application information from, for instance, libraries or library consortia, those entities serve the larger community, and there's not a population that's closely attached to that. In contrast, school districts have an identifiable population that they serve. It's the student body that attend those schools, and we were able to get that data by matching the school districts with CDE data. So we could really tell who's directly being served by the application that's being submitted by this entity. And the remaining question that we had when we went into this was, well, what about individual schools? You could submit an application as an individual school as well. And we faced more difficulty matching those to CDE demographic data at that level. And even if we could, there was the question of how to decide what decision we'd make to aggregate those jurisdictions up to the district level for sort of an apples to apples comparison of the district data and outcomes with the individual school. If not all the schools in a district applied, then how would you properly weight that? I won't go too much more into the weeds about it than that. But given that the preponderance of applications from California came from school districts, we thought, okay, here's a solid chunk of analysis that we can do and report this in a single way that provides a coherent story. We have another question from Sacramento. Can you elaborate on the specific challenges faced by English learners, Black and Latino students and low-income students in terms of digital access. Yeah, that's been the focus of a lot of our work, looking at basically the digital divide and the unequal access along those lines. The most recent data that we have, we put out a fact sheet about the digital divide in California a few months ago with my colleague Eric Asan, finding that 85% of California households have access to broadband, but among Black-led households, only 84%, Latino households, 81%, among low-income households, only 79%. So we've seen some improvement in those numbers over the years, but there's still a gap. If we look at rural households, it's really only 2 in 3, to get to the earlier question. Only 2 in 3 rural households have broadband access at home, compared with the 85% overall. In terms of devices, we see that 89% of California households have a connectable device. But again, among Black households, only 85%. Latino households, 84%, 83% of low-income households, et cetera. So we've seen some progress, and the gap is definitely narrowing, but we're not quite there yet. From another question asks, what with the ECF program concluding last month, June of 2024, what federal and state resources can schools leverage to continue bridging the digital divide, and how can these resources be most effectively utilized? It's a great question. The timing is perfect as well, because not only has the Emergency Connectivity Fund just run out. People who are paying attention to this will note that the another program, federal program, the ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program, just ended a couple of months ago. I think April or May was the last month that those funds were available to be spent, and those were there's another program, federal program designed to help with the problem of affordability. The programs that I put up during the last slide, federal programs, as well as the California State 156, State Bill 156, Senate Bill 156, excuse me, are really designed to address this program for specific populations, and so school districts, county offices of education, regional consortia, like councils of governments, for instance, that operate at the regional level, right down to municipal governments can apply for these various funds from those programs. And I would encourage them to look into those programs. The slides will be, as I mentioned earlier, on our website starting tomorrow afternoon. I don't want to downplay the importance of the local efforts that I just mentioned briefly. Looking at ISPs who have really partnered with their communities to make sure that their constituents are connected, and also nonprofit organizations. I'm in Oakland here, and for instance, Oakland Undivided is a partnership between the OUSD and the mayor's office that has really gone a long way towards getting people connected here in this town. There are numerous other examples of sort of hyper-local efforts throughout the state that are doing this work on the ground that should get that recognition. And another question is, how did the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbate the digital divide in California's education system, and what role did the ECF play in addressing these issues? The COVID-19 pandemic, as nearly everybody's aware, really highlighted existing inequities more than anything. We've been looking at the digital divide for a couple of decades now at PPIC, But just with an equity lens in general, when instruction went online, it became immediately clear that this was an urgent problem, because kids just weren't. Some kids were going to school, and other kids were not going to school at all, because they just didn't have the resources to get the instruction, to submit their homework, to connect with their teachers, to have any communication between their families and the school at all. So I would say that it highlighted these divides, maybe more than it exacerbated them. But then it is fair to say that it became such an urgent problem, particularly in education, more than in other sectors. And then that's frankly how PPIC got involved in it, as we were looking specifically at how this affected the educational system. What role did the ECF play in addressing these issues? That's what we've started to address today. We're really looking at how well districts were able to take advantage of these funds. But then in terms of student outcomes, in terms of how it affected test scores for the students whose districts applied on their behalf, et cetera. We looked at some of that in the report, and I would encourage you to read the report online if you're interested in that. I would caution that these are very preliminary results, and causality is a little bit hard to establish when we're so early on. We're looking at 2022, 2023 test scores before the effects of the emergency connectivity fund could really be felt. So I'd really caution that it's a bit too early to tell that. All right, well, thank you for those questions. Seeing no others at this point, I think it's time to wind up the program. I would like to thank the Sobrato Family Foundation for their support of today's program, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us online. I would also say, I want to emphasize, we'd appreciate you taking a moment to give us your feedback on this event. If you're pre-registered for the event, then you'll receive an email with a link to a short survey that I'd encourage you to take. But you can also scan the QR code that you should see on your screen now. And finally, a recording of today's event will be available by tomorrow afternoon on the PPIC website and on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it again or share it with your colleagues. And thank you, and have a good afternoon.